It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. We've heard about the work here for some time, and it's a joy to be with the brethren here and to meet brothers and sisters up in this part of the country. Good morning. I think we have some exciting things to talk to you about this morning and to show you. Things that will support our faith, but we're talking about Noah's Ark in the class period. This has, for a long time, been the atheist favorite object of ridicule. There's no way you can get all the animals on that ark. It's just an absurd story. There's no geological evidence for the flood, which I think is an absurd statement. But such opposition has affected, at least with many of the people I've talked to, affected the attitude of even some of the brethren. Maybe they don't accept what's being said, edge of their conviction, and puts the story back into the category of almost a tooth fairy and Santa Claus, and you can see that sometimes in some of the reactions to the comments that have been made. We can see the attitude of some expressed, for example, by Reverend William, who is professor of Old Testament history at Southern Methodist University there in Dallas. There was an article that had appeared in the paper indicating some had seen the ark. Maybe some of you have heard some of those stories. We'll talk about that before we're finished this morning. And he was quoted in the Dallas Morning News saying Noah's Ark will be discovered about the same time as Jack's beanstalk is found. I had said that the people over at SMU didn't have any more faith in the Bible than Mother Goose, and he pretty well documented that for me. He says, the whole notion of building in a week a boat big enough to hold and at the same time collecting two of every kind of animals is a formidable task. So here's a professor of Old Testament history that thinks it took a week to build the ark, and I think most of the students in the Bible class that, and would understand that God caused the animals to come to Noah, that he didn't have to collect them. But these are the scholarly objections that they raise when you get to be professor of Old Testament history at SMU. That kind of ridicule over a period of time has its effect, different from what we see in Scripture. Notice the attitude of Christ in Matthew 24 when he says, "For the coming of man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days which were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, they were marrying, giving in marriage until the day that..." Jesus thought this was a real story, or at least that's certainly indicated by his statement. And notice the comparison that Jesus makes. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. If the days of Noah were not real, if this is a myth, what does that do to the coming of the Son of Man? According to Jesus' argument. It was a real story. He's making an argument in response to those who say there's not going to be a judgment. All things are as they were since the fathers fell asleep. God's not going to judge. He says that this fact, that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, the earth was formed out of water and by means of water through which the world of that time was deluged. This is the New Revised Standard. And with water and perish. The word deluge there really comes from the word from which we get catastrophe. It's much stronger than just a lot of water or flood. They deliberately ignore this. His point is, these people who say it's God won't judge are ignoring the fact God has judged. And if this story of God's judgment by flood was not real, then what does that do to Peter's argument that God will judge? It's just a myth. Well, obviously that not only disagrees with Peter's conviction, but totally destroys his argument. And I think there is a deliberate ignoring of the evidence for the flood, and hopefully before we're finished this weekend you'll see that. Maybe you see it already, of course. I think there's a great deal of evidence for the flood. We'll just look at a few indications, I think very strong indications of the flood. We see strong indication from the fact that in every society see flood traditions, myths as some would call them, but they're basically the same, tell the story of the destruction by flood of 8 people on a boat, sending out the birds, 2 of each kind. All of the core facts are included. Their variations, as we would expect, as oral tradition is handed down from time to time, but it's everywhere. As here in Funk and Wagnall's Dictionary of Folklore, under the heading of deluge, we read a world cataclysm during which the world was inundated or submerged by water, a concept found in almost every mythology in the world. Archaeology's flood traditions from around the world. North America, there are 59 different traditions from the Navajos, from the Eskimos. In Central and South America, there are 56 different traditions that have been documented. In Europe, 31. In the Middle East, 17. In Asia, 23. 37 from the Pacific Islands in Australia. When I was in Australia, in the outback, the artisans there that had carvings on it, I asked him what that was about, and he said, this is the story of the flood. And he went through the whole story that was a part of their history. How is it that this story is the part of the history of virtually every society on the face of the earth? I really don't think there's any way to explain that apart from a common event in their history. I think that's excellent evidence. And most of you have seen the seashells up on top of the mountains. Now, there's some very fanciful descriptions of how that happened naturalistically. It doesn't work. I'd be glad to discuss that with you, but from the Pyrenees Mountains, 7,000 feet, we find this. From the Rocky Mountains, at 14,000 feet, we see these seashells in agate. I collected these from 14,500 feet in Bolivia. The trilobite is the top critter there, the cast in the mold, and then the seashells just below. I was recently in November in Israel, and here from the top of Mount Nebo, where here we see the overview looking at the land of Canaan. Moses didn't get to go into the land, but was able to view the land from that site. But right up there on top of the mountain, there are these seashells. And that's typical. On top of Mount Everest, you see seashells. That's an ocean bottom environment preserved there. All of this argues for the fact the flood was global, but this is a point that a lot of people contest. Not only was it real, but it wasn't just there's some 30 different universal terms that we see in the book of Genesis indicating the global nature of the flood. And yet people at SMU say, well, maybe there was a flood there in the Mesopotamian Valley. And what amazes me is there are some of our brethren that are preaching that. In Genesis 6, Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, and behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. And this was more than just people and animals that were destroyed. The earth itself was destroyed. I believe the earth was eroded to a depth of over a mile and then redeposited. And what we see on the continents is an average of about 1.5 miles of sedimentary rock, water-laid rock, with billions and billions of dead things in it. And when you have water-laid rock covering the continents with billions and billions of dead things in it, what does that look like? I don't think that says evolution. I think that says judgment much more effectively, but we'll be talking more about that through the week. In Genesis 7 and verse 19, we read, the water prevailed more and more upon the earth, and all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. Now, possibly they weren't as high as they are now, but if they were 1 mile high instead of 5 miles high, you're going to have a hard time having a local flood. That's 1 mile high. It just doesn't work that way. Genesis 7, verse, all flesh that moved on the earth perished, birds, cattle, beasts, every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, to all mankind. Here are these universal terms throughout the section. Now, if it's all, wouldn't one animal at least run over the hill? What if one bird flew over the hill? He says all birds perished. And what would you even need the ark for? Just go over the hill. The whole story becomes unreasonable. Genesis 7, every living thing that was on the face of the land. Now notice the qualifying factor here. Things in the ocean wouldn't have to be preserved on the ark. They can still survive in the flood. But everything that was on the face of the land perished. From man to animals to creeping things to birds of the sky, they were blotted out from the earth, and only Noah was left. How many people were on the ark? What was the flood population at that time? Some people say, well, maybe there weren't too many. They were all there in the Mesopotamian valley. Hadn't been too long since the creation. Use the Masoretic text or the Septuagint, either 2,500 or 1,500 years. How long does it take to get a population? We are oriented in terms of this evolutionary history of the world, millions of years, and now we're just at, 6 billion people? Must take a long time. Well, population dynamics, I think, provide a serious challenge to that. If you use the formula that I was using in mathematics, actually I didn't, I had a fellow that helped me. I depend on someone else to help me in this area. This is the formula you use to calculate population growth rates. The present world population growth rate is about 2%, according to the latest census. Now, when you use 2%, you get a huge figure, and we're told there have been catastrophes, and of course that takes into allowance what we see happening in the world, but we back that down to 0.9, less than half of the present population growth rate. Take two people using the Septuagint rendition of time, 2,500 years, creation to the flood, two people at 0.9%. How many people? Just over 6 billion people. But now wait a minute, we've been around hundreds of thousands, millions of years. I don't think so. That's one evidence. Population dynamics are a strong argument against that. Those were in the Mesopotamian valley either. I think they were spread around the world. Furthermore, Genesis 6, verse 11, of God and the earth was filled with violence. I don't think he's talking about lions and tigers there. The violence here was culpable. They were responsible. And so all of these universal terms was not only a real flood, but that it was a universal flood. I think there's a real killer argument, if you please, in Genesis chapter 9, verse 13. Just to die hard on this point. I'll set my bow in the cloud, God says. It shall be a sign of a covenant between me and the earth. What's the implication of the covenant? I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and never again shall the water become a flood to destroy all earth. And he's never had a local flood since then, has he? If there has been, then he lied, if that's what he was talking about. But whatever happened, what happened since, if God's truthful. And so there's no way to believe the Bible, to claim to be a theistic anything and say the flood was local. It just is an untenable position, though many people try to do that. But how in the world do you get all of those animals on this little bitty ark? That people, there were millions and millions of animals. I had one fellow argue, well, there are billions of insects just in 1 acre of land. Yes, but we're talking about 2 of each. 2 fleas, they ride the back of the dogs. You don't even worry about them. That's not a concern. But how many animals would there have been? Well, Ernst Mayr, one of the leading taxonomists in the country, he estimates there would have been about 1 million animals. Some would say more or less. Actually, he's one of the splitters. He would actually exaggerate the number according to some. With this estimate, do the fish, the sponges, do they have to be on the ark to be preserved? 70% of the earth's surface is covered by water. So we're only talking about the critters that live on about 30% of the earth's surface. Actually, we're looking at these, basically, and not all of these. Many of the mammals, like the whales, the porpoise, wouldn't have to be on the ark, and the reptiles, sea turtles, wouldn't have to be. But let's take this as an estimate to get a rough idea of what we're talking about. We've got a total here of 17,600 land animals. And these are species, not kinds, we need to point out. No, it's not species. I mean, see, it's not kind, it is species. There's a big difference there. We look, for example, in the scriptures at how the term species is used. We don't know exactly, but we got a rough idea. Fishes reproduce after their kinds, plural, so that includes a number of kinds. Hawks reproduce after their kind, singular, but there are a number of species of hawks. It's a superfamily in biology, so it's broader really than species. But using kinds and the Splitter's estimate of kinds, we come up with times 2, 35,000. Well, of course, the clean animals, there were, and some have become extinct since then, not as many, I think, as they would indicate, but we double that for extinction. We add 5,000 of the clean animals. There were 7 each of those, and that's wasn't anywhere near 5,000, but we're being just overly generous here in every department. We come up with a maximum of 75,000 using the Splitter's estimate, doubling for extinction. A more reasonable estimate, I think, would be more like 5,000 kinds. Some have estimated half of that who are experts in that area, but something like 5,000 kinds, 10,000 when we multiply it by 2, doubling it for extinction gives us 20. 1,000 is a much more reasonable estimate for the clean animals, and so somewhere around 21 to 25,000 would be a very reasonable estimate for the numbers of animals that would have to be on the ark. Well, would they all fit? Have an ark like a lot of people picture. Fisher-Price didn't really get his documentation from the scriptures. No, this kind of an ark, more like what you see pictured in the scriptures, would. And we notice that we see, and by the way, it's almost 2 football fields long, the height of a 5-story building, a tremendous structure. And we notice that we do have dinosaurs climbing up the ramp here. As people will say, well, were dinosaurs on the ark? Certainly it was big enough. But I think the really huge dinosaurs are the result of having grown for a huge length of time. Animals, certainly people, lived longer before the flood. And reptiles never stop growing, unlike mammals. They continue to grow. Alligator may be sexually mature at 3 feet. It may grow to almost 20 feet. And reptiles living longer, the dinosaurs God wouldn't have chosen, and Noah wouldn't have taken the great-grandpas, would he? The more viable youngsters would be more likely, and even could have taken juveniles. Interestingly, this article appeared in Newsweek ago. Here are trackways of brontosaurus the size of calves. And so maybe baby dinosaurs, I don't know. But certainly it was not a problem. We do see that they obviously survived the flood. We look at the petroglyphs, for instance, of the North American Indian, the Anasazi. Here you see the little head up in the upper right-hand corner of the circle, and the little feet there toward the center, and the tail toward the lower left. The Brontosaurus type, it's very difficult to photograph because of the heavy desert varnish that covers it, which also testifies to its antiquity. It's about 1,000 years old. They were drawing pictures of dinosaurs. Down in South America, in the Inca burial stones, in the tombs, you see drawings of dinosaurs from about 2,500 years ago. We've excavated some of those. Down in Mexico, in the Central Highlands, in Acámbaro, there are figurines that appear to be about 2,500 years old that are obviously of dinosaurs. We'll talk more about those later. The Emperor of China, according to Marco Polo, had dinosaur-like creatures pulling his chariot. Most people believe what Marco Polo said until they get to this story, and that has to be a myth. They just look right past what he said. We do know Sir George slew a dragon. There are pictures and paintings all over Europe, and this one is in Israel. Took a picture of it not too 11th century painting, and it is supposed to record a real event, but people just have been told it's a myth. I think the dinosaurs were on the ark. I think they survived. I'm not even really sure they're all gone. There's some interesting eyewitness accounts lately, but that's another story. What about the ark's capacity? Was it big enough to hold the animals? Well, if we assume the cubit is 21 inches, and it ranges historically from 18 inches up to 36 inches, 21, there's real good evidence for that with the ark. If we had time, we can talk more about that. That would make it 525 feet long, 87.5 wide, over 50 feet tall. That's well over 2 million cubic feet. That's the carrying capacity of approximately 750 railroad cars. Now, if you were coming to services this morning and had to wait on a train with 750 railroad cars, you'd still be waiting. It'd take a while. Well, how many animals can you carry in a railroad car? Well, we know, and there are laws that are passed about how many animals you can put in these railroad cars. What's the average size animal? We think horses, cows, the bigger ones, more impressive ones. The average size is actually about the size of a cat. There are many more smaller animals like the rats and the shrews. But let's double that, more than double that for the sheep as average, because we've got some figures on how many you can put in a railroad car. 240 sheep in the average railroad car, you can't have more than that, or it's dangerous to ship them across the country, I'm told. Well, if you take that figure, then you come up with 180,000 animals carrying capacity on the ark. They were spread out more than that, but that's how many you could carry. That's the carrying capacity. Now, how many did we have to have? When we equated kind with species, which we know is exaggerating the problem, taking the splitter's estimate, doubling the number for extinction, doubling the average size, we only had to carry 75,000 animals with all of those exaggerated estimates. But it's got a carrying capacity of 180,000. So obviously you can carry them on the ark. All can be accommodated in 42% of the ark's capacity. And if you use a more reasonable estimate for the number, about 25,000 instead of 75, then you've got them all in 12%. Now, who ought to be making fun here? You could have all the animals on the middle floor. No, let's put the animals on the bottom floor. Put the food up on the second floor and just drop it down to them. Mr. and Ms. Noah could have the top floor all to themselves. In fact, you could have room on the football field and still have room for all the animals to come up to watch. Can't get all those animals on the ark. Well, how many animals? Well, I don't know. Well, how big was the ark? Well, I don't know. But I know you can't get all the animals on the ark. This is the way the conversation goes. They're making fools of themselves, and we need to be able to show that. It's just not so. It's a very credible story. It's itself ridiculous. If you want answers to all the problems you could ever think of and more, let me recommend a book called Noah's Ark, a Feasibility Study by John Woodmarappy. He's researched every objection that's been made by the atheist for the past 100 years or more and answered it. Now, that's more than you want to know, I can assure you. But the answers are there. It's a very credible story. Well, let's address then the question, could it still be there? And no doubt many of you have heard of reported sightings that maybe it's still there, and some people respond, well, that's ridiculous. Why would it be ridiculous? Well, it was like 4,500 miles that long. And it's amazing to me that response comes when we're talking about something in the Bible, but if you're talking about archaeological artifacts, that doesn't faze them at all. There was a display in Dallas just recently of some Dr. Swift, colleague of mine, he's from Portland, in the background. And looking at the sign here is a boat from the Egyptian period about 3,500 years ago, roughly. 35 as opposed to 45, but look what kind of shape it's in. It's in great shape. 3,500 years ago. Well, that people, it doesn't faze them. Why, it's not possible? It's silly. Certainly it's possible. Certainly would be if it were frozen in a glacier, or at least frozen in an area that would help preserve it. Plus it was covered within and without with pitch, a preservative. Notice the statement by Gilbert Grosvenor, who was the first editor of National Geographic. Now, the present editor has a very different view. This was a while back. He says the discovery of Noah's Ark would be the greatest archaeological find in human history, the greatest event since the resurrection of Christ, and would alter all the currents of scientific thought. I think that's an understatement. it would certainly turn geology upside down. How did the geologist miss the most significant geologic event of all time? Well, with being willfully ignorant, I think is the way Peter described it. But both the physical and the historical geology textbooks, anthropology, archaeology would all have to start over. Zoology, biology, the humanities, religion. Reverend Powell will have to rewrite his textbook, wouldn't he, over at SMU. It's just hard to imagine the implications if this were consistently applied. Finding. Well, some will say, well, haven't they been and they didn't find anything? Or why don't you just go look and see? And it's not quite that simple. This is a picture of today, lesser and greater. Most of the accounts center around the greater Mount Ararat, and it is a huge mountain. It's just impossible to convey with pictures. It rises from almost sea level on a single peak up over 3.5 miles high. Probably the largest single peak in the world. Now, there are peaks that are higher, but they start 3 or 4 miles up when they begin, like Everest. But as a single peak, this may be the largest. It's a volcanic mountain. It's much of it is loosely consolidated. It rumbles and shakes sometimes, and boulders come tumbling down as you're trying to climb up. And it's a very rugged terrain. The area covers about 500 square miles. The top portion is covered by a permanent 75 square mile ice cap, up to 300 feet thick. And so it's not a simple question. Politically, there are also challenges. We're looking at a map of the area. It's in eastern Turkey. Here is Mount Ararat. At eastern Turkey, we notice the Soviet bloc just above it. It's just a few miles from Iran. It's 150 miles from Iraq. It's really not in a real good spot, to say the least. The Kurds have been at war with the Turks for the past 15 years. The body count's just over 50,000 in that war, and that's the area that it's in eastern Turkey. All of which makes it a serious challenge. This is the expressway that leads to Mount Ararat. It's not like our part of the world. Some friends of mine had rented the Volkswagen bus, the mirror of which you see in the left-hand corner. When they rented it, it had several bullet holes in it. It had several more bullet holes in it when they turned it back in. This was in 1990 when they were there. One of them is seen here on the left, one of the climbers that was able to explore in 1990, not the area they wanted to, with some of the Kurdish families that live there on the mountain. They were very friendly at this point until they found out they probably weren't good prospects as husbands for their daughters, and then they had to beat a hasty retreat with the wolf dogs behind them. They became very unfriendly. As you climb the mountain, you see often you take a step forward, you take 4 steps back as the rocks move and tumble. And as you sleep at night, you hope they don't tumble on top of you, which is a very distinct possibility. Once you get up on the glacier, then it's much easier, believe it or not. It's more stable. Here we see the fellow climbing up the sheer ice face with the rope going over the edge there in the foreground. This is not easy going, as you might imagine. Crevices may open up in the glacier just at any moment with any kind of noise, and a person can be in serious trouble. I'm not sure what the fellow's doing here with the camera. He should be getting a rope, but it can be a real problem. Just go look and see. Well, it's not that simple, as hopefully you can see. You do have, though, good reason to want to go see. You see ancient accounts mentioning the ark as a reality just as a matter of fact. Borosthus mentions it, Josephus mentions it. It's mentioned in some of the ancient Babylonian writings. The problem has been that the ice has built up, and we've seen a good demonstration of how that works with, some of you may have heard of the Lost Squadron. This was a plane a group of planes lost in World War II in Greenland. They were abandoned, and in 50 years, the ice built up. When they finally got back to recover them, they were 240 feet down in the ice. They were that much ice had built up in 50 years. Now, some of the arguments for the age of the earth are based on the layers of ice down in the Arctic, and each of these layers is supposed to represent 1 year, and here we've got thousands of them in 50 years, which refutes that. But the point is, ice can build up quickly. At the time of Josephus, Marco Polo, by the way, who camped out at the base of Mount Ararat, said he saw it. You could see it from the base of the mountain at that point. As the ice built up, it disappeared. Until 1840, when there was a huge earthquake that revealed, evidently, the ark again. A huge gash was opened up in the side of the mountain called the Shahina Dare. It's twice the size of the Grand Canyon, and evidently shook things up enough to shake the ice off to reveal it. And from that point, you see accounts beginning. We've had at least 34 credible accounts that seem to correlate from eyewitnesses since that point. Here we are looking at Georgy Hagopian, whose account seems to be one of the most credible. He lived at the base of the mountain in the early part of the 1900s. He, with his uncle, when he was 10 and 11, climbed up the mountain, he tells us, in 1908 and then again in 1910. He passed away in 1978. He moved to Montana, holding here a picture of the ark. This is Alfred Lee, a commercial artist who worked with Georgy Hagopian to draw what he saw, his eyewitness account of the mountain. And these are the pictures that were a result of that collaboration. Here's the vessel. Notice the window across the top of it. I'd always wondered about the description of the single window on the ark. How in the world can you get the ventilation with a single window? And then the King James rendition says it was finished a cubit and a half upward. Okay, now it makes sense. You have ventilation across the top in a single window, finished a cubit and a half upward. The stairs here on the end were put there by the pilgrims, those who went up, his kinsmen who had over the years done this. Sometimes the ice melted back further, but it's in a glacier, and we did check the weather record. Sure enough, one of the hottest years on record, two of the hottest years, 1908 and 10 when he went. That he climbed up. His uncle lifted him up to those steps, he says, and climbed up and looked in where the cubit and a half high window hit him on the leg, gave an indication of how large a cubit was as well, by the way. Here's another view of what he saw about 1910. This is another picture, totally different context. It was in the early 1900s, about 1917, when Russian aviators were flying over the mountain and saw this protruding from the glacier. They came back, reported it to the Tsar. He dispatched 43 soldiers up the mountain. They, according to the accounts, entered the ark, photographed it, measured it. While they were there on this 3-month expedition, the Bolshevik Revolution took place. The Tsar was killed. All the religious leaders were killed, and then they come back down the mountain with pictures of the ark. They were killed. 2 of them, we know, escaped and came to America. Dr. Artumov was one. He was a photographer. He worked in Oklahoma fields for a number of years before he passed away. We have talked with his nephew who saw this picture. He drew the sketch. He has, when we talked to him, he had the picture in his attic, but he was afraid to show it. That's another part of the story that'll take a while to get to, but this is his sketch of the picture that his uncle took, one of the 43 soldiers dispatched by the Tsar up on the mountain. Amazingly, it looks very similar to the picture that Hagopian told us about. This is from a still different context, the result of the efforts of George Green, who was a petroleum geologist in 1953 flying over the mountain, not a religious person, there tracing oil formations, came back with pictures that he had taken from his helicopter flying over the mountain. Here's this vessel sticking out of the glacier. Showed it to his friends back in Albuquerque. When he got home, they said, "What mountain is this?" He said, "Mount Ararat," and they were amazed. One of them was a nun. "This looks like the Ark," she would say. He went on to South America in another oil venture, and in the meantime, an Ark researcher, George Cummings, heard about what he had seen and went to investigate, talked to 12 of his neighbors who had seen the pictures, and it was about that time they saw in the headlines that Green had been murdered down in South America, tossed out of the 6th story of his hotel room, found floating face down in a swimming pool. The only thing missing from his room was the pictures. All the money, everything else was there. There's a family of Kurds that live about a third up the mountain that have as their purpose in life to protect the Ark from the eyes of the infidel. And we have documented the fact they've killed a number of people who got close. The Quran indicates that, and they believe that this is the place of Muhammad's return, and if they can keep it pure from the eyes of the infidel, it will hasten his return. And so they kill somebody that gets close. And so that's why this fellow was afraid to show the picture. They would come after him. That's why George Green was murdered. I'm getting ahead of myself with this picture. Let me back up here. All right. I hope I'm not confusing you. This is the picture that the friends who saw the photographs drew, but the photographs disappeared. We're looking here at Ed Davis, who was in World War II with the Army Corps of Engineers, building roads in the area of Mount Ararat. Don Shockey is on the right. He's made 5 trips up the mountain, and I'm on the left. We were interviewing him on videotape. He saved the life of the son of one of the Kurdish village chieftains, and as a result was adopted into the tribe. And as a part of the adoption ceremony, he says they took him up and showed him the Ark there at the end of the summer. There was a storm that came up as they got close. They weren't able to get to it, but they were within about 50 yards. He had Army field glasses, could see well. This is the photo, the drawing that resulted with from his collaboration with, again, Alfred Lee, the commercial artist, describing what he saw. At that point, it had broken into 2. And we see one here and one here. But you can see into the end, and especially notice this view here where the debris is coming down over the Ark. It's protruding back up into the glacier at this point. But he said he was able to see into the 3 decks. In 1990, we had a helicopter overflight that took this picture. We photographed particularly the canyon that Ed Davis had described. I say we, there's some friends of mine were there, close associates. At the time they flew over, they didn't think they saw anything. Do you see anything there? Probably not. But look close at this spot right here. The white area is the roof. Just in front of the area with a little notch there is the superstructure, is the blunt broken. We'll blow that up, and maybe you can see the debris flowing right under the tip of the arrow there over the top in the scene that we saw a moment ago. This is from a higher elevation from a helicopter than Ed Davis saw. One more time, it gets a little fuzzy. But again, under the arrow, you can see that debris flowing over it, the broken blunt end in front of the arrow with that notch there, the superstructure. You understand the implications of what you're looking at. I think when we coordinate this account, Hagopians with Ed Davis's, they came from different directions but wound up at the same place and described the same structure. And then the helicopter overflight virtually verifies it. We need better pictures, but this is certainly very encouraging. A friend of, and we compare that with the drawing, it certainly is intriguing and very similar. A friend of mine was there in '94 illegally, was not a competent mountain climber, amazing that he survived with his life, but he did get up there with a friend of his, got to the edge of the canyon, the friend tied a rope around his waist. He leaned over and just emptied the camera. He couldn't see down to the bottom, but he was photographing in all directions. And this was one of the photographs. If that doesn't give you chills, then something wrong. I think this is the Ark of Noah. Again, we need better photographs. We have acquired a lease on the 500 square miles that constitutes this area. As soon as the fighting calms down, it's like a Vietnam over there right now, then I'm on the team that will be going up the mountain, and we want to enter it, measure it, photograph it, and thoroughly document it. This is the scene from the north, from Russia, looking back at the Shehenan Dere, the big gash on the right. The Ark is at this spot right here, not on the top, but not far from the top. And documenting that would certainly be a thrilling experience. Before we conclude, let's think about some of the implications of this story. Referring back to Peter's account, he's responding to the objection of the people who were saying there's not going to be a judgment. Where's the promise of his coming? Since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as from the beginning of creation. They deliberately ignore this fact, Peter says. The world was deluged, the passage we looked at just a moment ago. God did judge, therefore he will judge, is the point. The point that Peter makes to us, to you and me, about the flood is don't ever doubt the judgment. People laugh. Sin is a big joke. It's funny. The flood says sin is serious. God will not put up with sin forever. And people may not believe, but it doesn't matter. They just have to deliberately ignore the evidence. It's real. Sin is serious. God will judge. And that's a powerful message that we see from the reality of the flood. Peter goes on to say the day of the Lord will come like a thief, in which the heavens will pass away with a roar, the elements will be destroyed with intense heat, the earth and its works will be burned up. Then by water, next time by fire, Peter says. The other message, the message of the ark itself, is a different message. It's one of mercy and love. If we'll humbly submit to God's will, then he'll save by his divine power. These were real events, Peter says. In the days of Noah, there were 8 souls, by the way, that were saved by water, Peter points out. The next verse corresponding to that, baptism now saves you. These are the messages that Peter draws from the ark. God will judge. You better submit to his will. No matter what the world thinks, they may laugh at the idea that water has anything to do with salvation. They laughed at Noah too. But you humbly submit to his will, or else. That's the message. I think I have about 5 minutes left. Let's see if we have some questions. And obviously this could go on much, much longer than we did this morning. We've been researching this for some time. Who would have a question? Yes, sir.
You mentioned the persecution of folks that are trying to get the message out. We don't see these pictures on TV. Is that one of the reasons?
That's part of it. We did this TV interview with Ed Davis, and it was about that time that the granddaughter of the one whose life he had saved, Abbas, over in Turkey, called him. She was in school at Arizona State University. She saw a news item about the interview and called and threatened him. The black hand of Allah is upon you. And he assured her that he had not promised anyone not to tell about it, that he didn't know this was taboo, and he would not say anymore. He had a book that was published. It was not republished. The book Agridah, if you find it, it's an intriguing story of what happened. That's the Turkish name for the mountain. Painful Mountain is the translation. But we cannot release that at this point. Yes?
Have you heard of a fellow named Jean Navarro? He's a Frenchman.
Yes.
Claims he found some parts.
He found some wood carbon dated it. There's some conflicts with his story. There's some obvious reality. It's hard to tell. You talk to several of the people. We've talked to several that went with him, and they tell conflicting stories. There's some problems with Navarro's story, though he did find some wood. No question about that. Up on the mountain, it was a different place from where the unanimous eyewitness accounts place it. Maybe it was debris that had drifted down. Maybe it was from a later time. I don't know. Yes.
Is there a reason why you don't have any satellite pictures from space?
We do. However, the ones that are helpful are classified. Landsat gets us, they say, down to 3 meters. That's an exaggeration. That's not really so. Plus, it's under the ice. However, there is a spy satellite that has microwave technology that can see under the ice, has spectrographic capability. It knows what it's seeing. And we have talked to the fellow who designed it and had him look for us. Now, he says, if you see what I see, we'd have to shoot you. But I was sitting across the desk, and he was looking at it on his computer screen. And he gave us the coordinates. We know exactly where it is. He saw precisely the two pieces that Ed Davis had described in the spot. Now, that's, to me as a scientist, that's probably the most confirming evidence. I mean, eyewitness accounts are good. It's time to go look and investigate, but the real evidence is there. I think we can say well, you can't talk about that, but I know that it's there, and based primarily on that evidence. I was sitting there talking to the fellow. The fellow was an atheist. He wasn't he didn't have an axe to grind. He was sitting there looking at it when I was talking to him. He says, I can't really say it's wood, but it's a vegetable fibrous material that looks like what wood would look like if it were wood. And the dimensions were precise. It also tells us what a cubit is. Yes?
Just curious about the size of the mountain. Can you compare it to another one? In my mind's eye, it's
3.5 miles high is a long ways. It's hard to imagine. It's larger than the peak that forms Mount Everest, though Mount Everest is 3 miles up when it starts. There's no counterpart to it. You really can't grasp it without seeing it. Yes?
I read a book in the 50s about the flood dealing with either Germany or France, crevices that had mixed bones of herbivores and carnivores in there. Have you heard anything about that?
There are a number of spots like that where dinosaurs and modern, like in North Carolina, there's one place. The one you're talking about may be the iguanodons, the dinosaurs that were in the coal seam in the crevice fell in. Their explanation was they fell down a crevice. They were where they're not supposed to be geologically, and so they imagined a crevice they fell into and then got covered up. That's one in Germany. I'm not sure, but that could be. I think they were buried in the flood, yes. Thank you very much for your attention this morning. I hope you find those things stimulating and interesting.